This is Brent. Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up a racket all night long. This is a Common Lawyer Comments. We're going to talk about the Constitution of the United States. Constitution of the United States, question number 259. Well, the questions and answers, Catechism on the Constitution. What kinds of causes are tried in the courts of the United States? Remember, there are two kinds of courts in our country. There are courts called state courts, sovereign, within the sovereign jurisdiction of each state is a system of state courts. Trial courts, that's the lower level court. That's where the jury is impaneled. Appellate courts, you can appeal up to the appellate court. And then the Supreme Court of your state, the court of last resort of your state. Unless you live in Nevada, there are only two levels. There's the trial court and the Supreme Court. That's it. Last I checked, but that's been a while, come to think of it. I've been there, I've looked, I've seen it. Been a lot of years ago. So there are the state courts, sovereign within each state, of the sovereign of each state, and then there are the courts of the general government in Washington, D.C. The general government, and it's sovereign. These are sovereign and separate. 51 sovereignties. 51 sovereignties, each state being sovereign, and the general government in Washington, D.C. being sovereign within the District of Columbia. You see, it's analogous. Oh, I just use this as an analogy. Does the general government of the United States, the national government, is that a country? And yes, it is. Does it have territorial boundaries? Yes, it does. Does it have a law that applies to those territorial boundaries and does not apply to the states? Yes, it does. Well, what is the country called the United States government? It's Washington, D.C., exactly 10 square miles of territory that the states of Maryland and Virginia, they're contiguous states, they share a common border, and they each donated land on both sides of the Potomac River, one on one side, one on the other. They surveyed it into 10 square miles. It's a square. Stupidly, in my humble estimation, it's not square with the world, but it's a square. You know, a square that's not square with the world is called a diamond, like a baseball diamond. Well, Washington, D.C. is not square with the world, north, south, east, and west, like is the rest of the surveying of the country. Why? Because they got all uppity and highfalutin after we whipped the British, and they let a Frenchman come in, design Washington, D.C., thought he was really something. That's the evil empire sneaking into our country. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you'll discover it's almost impossible to find your way around. And it is impossible for anybody to give you directions. Why? Because the French, after the French Revolution especially, had the Roman system of surveying. The Roman system of surveying is circles. Yeah. Do you see the problem? If I go to Salt Lake City, Utah, for instance, I've been there lots of times. I have to say Salt Lake, there are a lot of towns and cities in America like Salt Lake, but Salt Lake's easy to get around in because Salt Lake is surveyed north, south, east, and west. It's square with the world. I'll say that much for it. Square with the world. You have north first, north second, north third, south first from Main Street going south, and east and west, like this. Easy. You say north third, I know where north third is. That's an east-west street that runs east and west, and it's north of Main. You know, that's the way a lot of towns like that. If English-speaking people surveyed a place, it was laid off in squares. If the French did it, it's laid off in circles. Woefully impossible to find your way around. Washington, D.C. is a square set perfectly unsquare with north, south, east, and west. It's a diamond. And inside of it, everything's circular, going out from the edge like pieces of a pie. You say, Brent, do you really know what you're talking about? Yeah, I really know what I'm talking about. Why? Well, I grew up in a world like that. Remember, I said Terre Haute, the French settled it first. They also went downriver here and settled a place called Vincennes. They're not surveyed in a way that really makes it as easy as you wish it was sometimes. Now, Terre Haute has had an overlay of the English common law surveying system. It's a common law system. It's just north, south, east, west, the way God laid off the world. The French, you see, they denied that. They denied God. That's why they have the metric system. That's why their calendar was different from ours for such a long time. They weren't going to date the calendar from the birth of Jesus Christ. They wanted to be blasphemous about it. Well, the government of our general government of the United States as a country, it's kind of like the Vatican. Is the Vatican a country? Answer, yes. What is Vatican? That's the name of a hill in the city of Rome. Vatican. Well, they've laid that off, and that's a country. We never recognized it as a country until Ronald Reagan. I thought it was a stupid thing to do. Couldn't stop it. I'm not in charge of doing that. Should have never been done. Of course, I suppose the Pope always has been head of state, but it's kind of analogous. But our general government in Washington, D.C. has absolute authority over the District of Columbia, D.C., within the territorial boundaries of that diamond. They have territorial power. They are the government, Congress and all, the government of Washington, D.C. Well, I think they set it up any way they want. They have. They've incorporated the city and they got a mayor now, but it's not state jurisdiction. They can go there and no state has any jurisdiction to go in there and stop Congress from meeting, you see, or arresting the president. You follow what I'm driving at? That's the way it's set off that way. Yeah. Not a bad idea. How else are we going to do it? They have to have a place to meet that the states have no jurisdiction over, and that's what we have. And the Constitution of the United States says that they will establish a place 10 square miles. Now, as far as I'm concerned, what they ought to do is shut that place down and move Washington, D.C., or the seat of the general government, someplace out in the middle of Kansas, someplace. That's what they need to do. Why? Well, number one, it's too far away from most of the country. Number two, so many lobbyists and negative influence have been entrenched there for so many years, it's ingrown. That's why, who was it? The FBI moved their headquarters to Huntsville, Alabama recently, since Trump got in office, trying to bring a separation between the intertwining evil influences of the deep state. That's why, of course, our forefathers knew that was important. Separation of powers. They put the Congressional Capitol building a mile away from the White House just to make that point. And they're not the same bunch. They're adverse, co-equal branches of government. The Supreme Court did meet in the Capitol until after 1900, into the 1930s, I believe. Then they finally built the Supreme Court building that was separate from the Congress. That should have been done a long time ago. Well, so we got these two sovereignties. So each sovereignty has a separate set of courts. To review, remember, our Constitution of the United States only establishes one court, just one, and that's the Supreme Court of the United States. And then our Constitution delegates authority to Congress to establish other courts under the Supreme Court if they want, to define their jurisdiction, to get rid of them whenever they want, to make more courts, however they want to set it up. And as they've set it up, it's a common law traditional system of two appellate levels above the trial court. Well, what kinds of causes are tried in the courts of the United States? Remember, the only jurisdiction that a federal court has, the courts of the United States, that includes the Supreme Court of the United States and all those other courts that Congress has created under the Supreme Court, their jurisdiction is really narrow. The scope of it. Well, what is it? Well, it has to be something that arises under. It has to be a question, a fight, a dispute that arises under, a disagreement that arises under the Constitution of the United States. That limits it a lot, a whole lot. The federal courts have no authority to hear cases on abortion. Our Supreme Court recently said that. They finally threw out Roe v. Wade and said this has never had anything to do with our authority under the Constitution. The Constitution does not give us any authority over abortion. That's a state question. Constitution of the United States gives the general government in Washington, D.C. no power, no authority over education. Can you find education in the Constitution of the United States? Not mentioned any. Why? Because our Constitution has chosen not to give that subject or power to the federal government in Washington, D.C. That is why DJ Trump wants to get rid of the Department of Education. We didn't have a Department of Education in the federal government until Jimmy Carter. That hadn't been that long ago, friends. Jimmy and Billy, remember Rosalind, all that bunch from down there in Georgia, ultra wealthy peanut farmers, made ultra wealthy by an ex-slave. Yeah, Jimmy Carter is ultra wealthy. His family became ultra wealthy because of an ex-slave that found over 300 marketable products. A chemist, an ex-slave who became a chemist and found over 300 marketable products of the peanut. And when the boll weevil decided to come in, moved in from Mexico, had his little sombrero on, sitting around, remember, sitting on the square. Last time I seen the boll weevil, he was sitting on the square. And he had his whole blamed family there looking for a home. And they moved up from Mexico and wiped out the cotton crop in the South. And the cotton farmers went bust. Big statue of the boll weevil down at a little town in Alabama called Enterprise, Alabama. Look it up. Great big statue of a boll weevil. Well, they wanted to pay credit to the boll weevil because they got richer on peanuts there than they would on cotton anyway. So he's the one that finally woke them up, said, start growing peanuts, see? Goober peas, that's what people called them until they became respectable. I learned about all this when I was a boy. Peas, we used to sing the song. Did you sing the song when you were a boy? When you were a girl in school? Peas, 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 eating goober peas. Oh goodness, how delicious, eating goober peas. Goober peas, that's peanuts. That was a great song. Well, the peanuts, though, became very valuable, more than just eating. They had a chemical and industrial use, and the oil, and just all the things that go with it. That more than, that ex-slave, his name was George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver. He knew more about the peanut than anybody will ever know, and he's forgotten more about the peanut than anybody will ever learn. I mean, he knew so much. He spent his life, he devoted his whole life to the peanut. I believe he died right after World War II, I think. Well, the sovereignties are different. Are there any other subjects that the courts, the Supreme Court and the courts under it may hear? No, really, there aren't. It has to be in the Constitution. Now, he mentions, for example, treaties between the United States and other nations. Now, there are some subjects that the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over. You're not allowed to bring these subjects into the lower courts, federal courts. The Supreme Court, for instance, according to our Constitution, has exclusive and original jurisdiction. That means you got to take it straight to that court. Any questions having to do with treaties with other countries, any questions having to do with treaties to other countries, you say, well, that doesn't happen very often, does it? And you know, it's funny. We had a case in that little town where we were that had to do with the treaty. And we moved the lower court to transfer it to the Supreme Court of the United States. It happens more often than you would think. There's something that happens in a little tiny town in a local federal court. We say, wait a minute, this is a violation of a treaty. We've got to remove this to the Supreme Court of the United States. And you file the papers, and they say, we'll take it or we won't take it. Yes, you're right. We do have exclusive jurisdiction. Of course, each court in the first instance has to decide whether or not it has jurisdiction. The court itself decides. And you can appeal that too, of course, but let's say the Supreme Court says, we on a treaty case like that, which we had in a case once, let's say the Supreme Court says, we don't have jurisdiction. And we say, well, we disagree. Well, then where would we appeal that case to? We wouldn't. We'd fight it out right there in the Supreme Court of the United States and try to reconsider and get them to do it, because they have exclusive and first jurisdiction, only jurisdiction over cases having to do with treaties and ambassadors from other countries. What other causes are there? Well, ambassadors or other public ministers or consuls. Consuls, you know, a consul is a fellow that another country sends over here to live around a seaport and make sure that everything we watch and make sure that the treaties that his country has with America, that we observe them properly. Anything else, it says, well, all causes concerning the taking or detaining ships at sea, and all which concerns crimes committed at sea, harbors, rivers, or forts and dockyards belonging to the United States. Now, remember I said that the District of Columbia is, as it were, a country, the country called the United States, really. The rest of the country are the separate sovereign states. Does this government of the United States, this sovereign government, have absolute control and jurisdiction over any other land area within the United States? Answer, yes. All military bases, all military shipyards, U.S. Navy shipyards, all U.S. Navy ships, all Army bases, all federal courthouses. That's exclusive jurisdiction, what goes on in there. If you have a federal courthouse in your state, what goes on in there isn't governed by the laws of your state. That's governed by the United States government. When you step in that courthouse, you're stepping into a different sovereign jurisdiction. Just keep that in mind. What if you go to a national park? Same deal. You're stepping into the sovereign jurisdiction, because I don't think it's right in that case, but they claim they own that land. I believe that's pretty questionable, but boy, they're certain, aren't they? National forest, things like that. Did you know that if you ride a horse, this is a big thing at home, the Shawnee National Forest is in our neck of the wood, the Shawnee National Forest, named after the Shawnee Indian tribe. Nasty bunch, nasty bunch. Tough. I mean, downright. Well, there wasn't any chivalry with them. They just kill you and eat you. They didn't care how old you were, what sex you were, just kill you and eat you. Over 1,500 white folk on record, and probably a lot more, over 1,500 roasted alive and eaten in what is now the state of Kentucky alone. 1,500 that we know about. Rest assured, there were a lot more. Yeah, eaten. People talk about the noble savage. I had somebody say recently, I said, well, you're a savage. I can't remember who it was. Nice fella. Somebody, it was a friend. He said, well, I object to moniker, Savage. I said, why? Don't you live out in the woods? He said, yeah. Well, he did. Lived out in the woods. I knew where he lived. I know it wasn't far from the home place there. He lived in the woods, had him a place out in the woods, nice fellow. Married a shirt-tail cousin of my mother's, which had been, I guess, a shirt-tail cousin of mine. Her name was not Tompkins, but Thompson. Yeah, Thompson. A sweetheart of a gal. I said, don't you live in the woods? He said, yeah. I said, well, it's just savage is just a Latin word that means a fellow who dwells in the woods. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You know, we tend to attach things to words that have nothing to do with the use of the words in the past, the etymology of the word. In this case, savage. It's a good word. It's a nice word. I know a lot of people live out in the woods, have nice homes in the woods. In Latin, they're called savages because they're woods dwellers. Well, the law in the national forest is if you're riding a horse, and this was a big deal at home, a lot of folk ride horses in the national forest, the Shawnee National Forest. And if your horse happens to drop some road apples, that's what folk call them around here. Road apples, you know, because they drop, they're round, they look like apples. If your horse, or as they say at home, your horse, I'm trying to clean, sometimes I say it nicer, horse, the correct pronunciation. My granddaughter said to me 2 days ago, well, don't be eating. She started grabbing, I said, you got to wash your hands first. She said, I got to do what? I said, wash your hands. She said, why do you say wash instead of wash? I said, because that's what I'm used to doing. Some things I don't want to stop doing. You notice it's Washington. Why is that? That's just what I'm used to saying. I have changed some, but you should have heard me when I was 15, how I talked. You think I'm bad now. Some of you are probably complaining about it. I can hear you. I've had people complain. When I was getting an education, it tended to wash some of that out of my system. But then when I'd come home, I'd fall right back into it. That's the way it works. Well, if your horse drops road apples out in the woods within 50 feet of a stream, that means a creek, there's another one, creek, a brook, a rill. You know what a rill is, R-I-L-L, that's something that runs into a creek. Actually, a rill runs into a branch. Now, this is the way the words are used where I'm from. A rill runs into a branch. A branch runs into a creek. And a creek runs into a river. Now, how do you tell the difference? Well, it's purely a matter of size, comparatively speaking. Well, how do you decide whether it's a creek or a river? Well, that's pretty touchy. Depends upon how you feel at the time, I suppose. Most people around where I'm from err on the smaller side. I mean, if it's a small river, they call it a creek. If it's a branch, if it runs into a creek, well, then it's a branch. And if it runs into a branch, it's a rill. And if it runs into a rill, what is it? It's a ditch, just a ditch. And a ditch, if it runs far enough, it'll turn into a rill. And then if it runs a little further, if it doesn't run into a rill, doesn't run into a creek, it'll turn into a creek. And it runs a little further, then it'll turn into a river. You know, there's places up in Minnesota where the rippling waters fall, where you can just step over the Mississippi River, because that's where the Mississippi starts, and it's just nothing but a little rill, and you can just step over it. See, that's the way gravity works. Well, what he's saying here is admiralty law is the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal courts. According to our Constitution of the United States, our Constitution of the United States is the instrument, the written instrument that the militiamen of the United States used to delegate authority to the general government in Washington, D.C., and to the courts of that government. One of the things that they delegated exclusive jurisdiction to matters pertaining to admiralty law. Ships at sea, navigatable waters within the United States, around the United States. Then the question comes, well, are they navigatable? What about waters that are only navigatable part of the year? Does the general government in Washington, D.C. have admiralty jurisdiction over those? The river I grew up on, growing up, was a river that we called a creek that runs into the Wabash River. It's a river that we called a creek that runs into the Wabash River. Is it navigatable? Yeah, by dugout canoe. When it's running half bank, you could run a pretty good sized raft down it, and people used to run flatboats down it. When the creek, they'd wait till the water was up, they'd build a flatboat, they'd load coal or wood or hogs on it, timber, that they needed some hardwood timber because they didn't have it south of us. We'd go down, people would take the boats down to the Wabash, run down to Ohio, down to Mississippi, and they'd take it downriver through the Delta. The Delta starts in southern Illinois and it fans out clean to the coast, down into Alabama and East Texas. Well, all that area doesn't have the hardwood trees we have up here. Red oak, white oak, hedge, piss elm, we called it. All those tightly grained hardwoods. So people would sell them south of here, down through the Delta. If they could get as far south as Cairo, they'd have a market. Anything south of there. So they'd load them up. They'd build a little flatboat, load it up, put some hogs on it. If they thought there was a hog market to the south, that was a big one. And coal. There were no coal mines south of southern Illinois. West Kentucky, there were some, yes. But still, that was a big commodity. Southern Indiana, southern Illinois, East Kentucky, coal. And they'd load that thing up, that flatboat, and wait till the water got up in the spring, and then they'd run it down. They'd run it down the creek. Then they'd hit the Wabash. Well, then it was easy sailing. Then they'd float down the Wabash, and then they'd float on down the Ohio, and Ohio'd hit the Mississippi, and then they'd just go on down. Well, is the creek, when it got up during the year and you could float a flatboat, is it navigable water? Oh, absolutely. Do the feds have jurisdiction? Absolutely. Have they taken jurisdiction? Oh, yeah. The Federal Army Corps of Engineers, that's the federal government, has always had jurisdiction over that creek. And you can just run a canoe down it or a flatboat a lot of the year, or not a flatboat, but a flat bottom John boat a lot of the year, yeah. But to use it to haul goods, commodities like coal, lumber, you got to wait till it's up in the spring. Well, if you just had a canoe, all you could do is have one or two men going at a time. Is that navigable? You bet. That falls within the jurisdiction of the federal government. And when our country started, when the militiamen of the several states ratified that document called the Constitution of the United States, much of the travel, much of the migration in America was done in creeks, in dugout canoes and other kind of little boats that were constructed, and it was a means of migration into our part of the world. No question. So, but the question now comes, If the federal government has exclusive admiralty jurisdiction, that means only the federal courts have admiralty jurisdiction. Jurisdiction over ships and navigatable waters and sailors and flat boatmen, all those kinds of things. That's all a matter of, that's why when you go into the federal courtroom, there's an admiralty flag there often, just to tell everybody we do have admiralty jurisdiction here, and rightly so. The Constitution of the United States grants it to us. Do the state courts have admiralty jurisdiction? No, I'd challenge you. I don't know. I've never seen, never heard of an admiralty flag in a state court. Why? Because the Constitution of the United States does not grant admiralty jurisdiction to the state courts. That's reserved. The states, as a matter of fact, the militiamen, through the Constitution, have chosen to slice that jurisdiction off and give it to the federal courts. Why? Because commerce between the states and through the country and around the country and the oceans would cease if the states had admiralty jurisdiction. The barges now, large, huge, massive barges of grain, chemicals, coal, cattle, lumber, going down the Ohio, going down the Mississippi, going down the Arkansas, rivers. All that would stop when the river, as it went from one state to another, they'd stop and say, well, you do what we say, and we're going to govern what goes in our state. That would impede progress. They had to change. Well, in this state, we could do this. It's just like saying to people, because let's say another example. Our Constitution of the United States says that because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people, the militia, to keep and carry a gun, the right, the duty, arises out of law. It's a duty, shall not be infringed. See, really, that's there to preserve the immediate response of the militia. If the states had the power, watch me, and it hasn't been litigated this way, and it should be. If the states have authority, or if they did, they don't have authority to say you can't have a gun. Well, then when the president of the United States called forth a militia from your state or any militiaman from your state, he wouldn't have a gun. He wouldn't have a military grade weapon because the state has done away with that and said you can't have a gun. That's why it's important that for the integrity of what our Constitution has established, that the general government not infringe upon the ability, the state governments not infringe upon the ability of a man to carry a loaded military grade weapon. Because if they can thwart the whole purpose of the Constitution and the jurisdiction of the President of the United States to call forth a militiaman or many militiamen. That's constitutional law. That's the way it works. We have a system of a tradition, a common law in our country that no other country has followed. It's two sovereignties. Your state, 49 other states, each sovereign, and a 51st sovereign called the general government of a very narrow jurisdiction, though, very narrow. Let's see. What other cases are tried in these federal courts? Question 263. Listen to this. Here's another one. All disputes in which the United States is a party. All court cases, if somebody sues the United States, well, then that's automatic federal jurisdiction if the United States wants to remove it to a federal court, because our Constitution says that's federal jurisdiction. All disputes between one state and another state. If two states go to have a legal case against one another, for example, Illinois and Kentucky, it was a well-known case. One time trying to decide, a fella got on a ferry boat, I believe it was down at Cave and Rock, that ferry's still there, and he had a wallet, he thought, in his pocket. Well, during the ride across the river, I forget which direction he was going, He claims to have lost his wallet. And he claims that the ferry boatman or somebody working on the barge, one of the deckhands, stole it. Does admiralty jurisdiction apply? No question. That's easy. Yes. So that's a federal court case right there. But let's say that just for a case of argument, for hypothetical, and this did come up in the case, which admiralty applies, but they were trying to say where's the line between Illinois and Kentucky. It had never been decided where the line was. And they had to try to decide, and they did decide. And of course, Illinois said the line, their state line, ran clean to the high water mark on the Kentucky side of the river. And Kentucky argued no. Illinois' state line is on the high side of the Illinois side of the river, see? Well, the Supreme Court of the United States, or the federal courts, have jurisdiction over that matter, not the state courts. If the state courts had jurisdiction, and they filed it in Kentucky, for example, the state courts in Kentucky, who would win the case? That's easy. Kentucky would win. What if they filed it over in Illinois, in Frankfurt someplace? Well, who would win that case? Illinois. You see, that's why if a state sues a state, it goes to federal court. That's a neutral ground for both states. It's a fair playing field. That's due process. That's part of the process. See what else we got here. All disputes between one state and another state. All disputes in which a state sues a private person that is a citizen of another state. You got the same problem. The state of Wyoming sues somebody in the state of Minnesota. Well, where does that go to court? Well, if it goes to court in the state courts in Minnesota, who's going to win? That's easy. If it goes to court in the state court in Wyoming, who's going to win? Well, it's not fair, see? That's due process is fairness. So where does that case go? To a federal court, a supposedly neutral ground. Well, for sure, neither state, it's not a home court for either state. In such a case, it goes to a federal court. Remember, inside of a federal court, you're in a different territory. You're on land belonging to the general government in Washington, D.C., and none of the state laws apply on that land in that federal courthouse. The state rules of evidence, none of it applies. Well, let's try another one. If they don't want it to, they can use it if they want. Here's another one where a citizen of one state lays claim to land in a different state. You see, the problem's always the same. Who's going to get the home court advantage, see? And where that problem arises, it'll be in the federal courts. How about one of the states sues a citizen of a foreign country? Can a state court take that case? Answer no. It would be fair. Here's another one. All in which the citizens of the states, and one citizen of one state, one citizen is in Virginia, and he sues somebody in California. Can that case be tried in a California court or a Virginia court? No. That's going to go to a federal court in one of those two states where there's neutral ground. Or at least the appearance of neutral ground, we hope. That's why a lot of times presidents will appoint federal judges in a state, like in Ohio. They'll appoint that federal judge from New England or Kansas. Mix them all up because it gives more opportunity for neutrality in these cases I'm talking about. That's called due process. Fairness is due process. Fairness of a fight in the courts is due process. What if a citizen in one state sues a citizen in another state? A citizen in Wisconsin sues a citizen in Arizona for breach of contract. Now what do you do? Well, that could go to a federal court too. Now, in that case, It's just the rules, the way they played out. If they both agree, they can be in any one of the state courts, but that'd be stupid. You have the right, either party has the right to say, no, we got to go to federal court. That's Erie Railroad versus Tompkins, for those of you that take an interest in such things. You've heard of the Erie case. Patriot mythology says that's a bad case and it got rid of the common law. That is not only wrong, that's just downright absurd, silly, and stupid to say that the case says that. It never said that. What it does say is that in such cases where one citizen in one state sues a citizen of another state, and they go into a federal court, Erie Railroad, or Tompkins versus Erie Railroad said you have to use the law of one of the states. You can't use just federal law. In that case, you have to choose which law to use. And it's common law, one of the all common law states. So that's what that case stands for what it's worth. This is Brent. Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, coming to you, coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up a racket all night long.